So I guess the best way to show modifiers in depth is to show how we deal with modifiers versus how Blender deals with modifiers. So if we go under add modifier, we can choose to say bevel this object. There we are, beveling our cube. We're rolling our segments interactively. We click and we're done. This object has now been beveled. If we shift A, add a cube, and we go under the modifiers and we choose to do the same thing. This is something that I was showing previously, but I'm not trying to, over exaggerate how slow things can get inside of Blender, but when it comes to this type of workflow, doing it over and over tons and tons of times a day, it can definitely get tedious, especially when it comes back to the process of getting in here and actually dealing with the bevel itself. So we could see that there's two different ways that you could be doing things. You could be going through the stack and actually adding modifiers yourself, or you could actually just go in and just interactively have that added. And so that's really our difference of modifiers between our modifiers and what you can do in Blender. The easiest way to find out more about the modifiers is to hover over them and read their tooltips. So bevel, we've already discussed quite a bit in depth, so there's no need to actually go into it more in depth, except for bypass scale. Bypass scale is one that's rarely talked about. However, by shift clicking bevel, you can actually launch it without it actually applying a scale. Right here, we have scaled the shape on the Z to the point that the bevels have become skewed. So this has resulted in a kind of unacceptable looking shape. So bevel inherently will correct such a thing and allow you to get the bevel back right by applying the scale. However, let's say you want to apply the bevel, but you didn't want, let's say you want to adjust the bevel, but you didn't want to apply the scale. Well, that is where shift clicking it comes in. By shift clicking, we can just bypass the apply scale portion to allow you to adjust the bevel without having to worry about that, versus something like that happening later on if you had this like parented to another shape and its transformations were still unapplied. So in a nutshell, that's one of the ways that we kind of approach modifiers differently. The next one I want to talk about is solidify. As you see, for simple shape, solidify is a main menu option. Like for plane, solidify will show up. Bevel will also show up because it has a 2D behavior. But with solidify, we look at this and basically there's only two things to it. You click it, it adds a solidify, or adjusts it, or you control click it and it'll add a brand new one. So we click it, it adds a solidify, we're done. Let's shift A, add a cube, just to bring this point home, and I'll select these two, perform a difference. And we'll sharpen this just to get the shading right. And by selecting this shape, let's say we wanted to solidify it a second time. Well, control clicking it will allow us to actually solidify it to be able to have a second solidify on it. So if we were to take this shape through a mod scroll by shift clicking that mod scroll toggle, we were able to first look at the unmodified mesh, then solidify, resulting in this double mesh. So we were able to keep things fairly non-destructive. We could still get in here and adjust the bevel if we wanted to. We could even shoot the bevel all the way up to being a circle and then hit C for clamp overlap, which will cause a bit of an issue, but no worries. We'll just bring in Weld and just roll Weld up the stack to make sure that the geometry is perfectly welded at the points where things are converging, and we're able to continue on with this with our shape that we're talking about here. So that in a nutshell is what Solidify brings to the table. Array, I've already talked about in depth as far as how Array has been a constant study of us attempting to improve upon what you can do with arraying and duplicating meshes and workflow and getting things where you need them without a whole lot of rigmarole. And we've even talked about how we've tried to expand on Array in the past to very consequential results by adding a big circle to it and having it be able to do radials and twists and all this stuff, which I actually wrote off as a bit of a failure. Not a failure in the execution or anything. The execution is brilliant. Just the planning and the way that we put it together could have used a little bit more refinement. So I'll put that back on Array V2. But basically Array and Mirror we've already toggled and talked about heavily over the course of this video. When it comes to the modifier helper is located on Control tilde. However, if you're needing to just bring it up without using the hotkey, you're able to do that just through the Q menu. So there might be a need for us to remove some of this and just force people to use hotkeys so there's less options to actually scare people. Toggle modifiers is there to toggle the modifiers off and on an object. And there's also a simple just apply modifiers and then control click for smart apply in the event that you're wanting to keep certain modifiers live. So that brings us to the gist of what makes us unique in hard ops when it comes to modifiers. All right, so we have this cube. It's fairly simple. Let's begin taking it through a journey. So I'll press SX and we'll press R4 or 5 to rotate it. And I'm going to select these two edges and we'll just bevel them, but manually. And I'll press C to clamp overlap it to prevent them from overshooting. And we'll just look at this from top view and just mirror it to the other side, making a heart. And I wasn't actually trying to make a heart, but looks like we cut in a little bit shorter. Let's say we wanted to make some modifications to this shape. Well, that's where Lattice comes in. If we use Lattice, the main thing about modifiers in hard ops is just know that anything that we add to hard ops, we intend to support to some level that we intend to expand on. So like everything has some sort of addition added to it. So with Lattice, there's a special queue menu that comes up that will allow you to do things like choose to have your points only on the outside, simplify it. Like if I have a ton of spans in my object and then I want to simplify it back to its most basic shape, I can just do that with simplify. And there's even an option to turn a lattice into a shape, which I always found to be a little bit crazy, but I'm a big fan of lattices and I use them heavily in my work. So this is just me, getting in here, just using lattice, just having a little bit of fun with it. And we're just deforming this shape, and it looks like we're not going to get a lot of deformation done because of how this shape is assembled. So the easiest way to find out how this shape is assembled is to press Alt V and look at the wireframe, and we have no loops. We have no loops. So the easiest way to get around this is to, well, firstly, I'm going to go through a modifier scroll, and we're just going to shift click, or actually control click to apply the modifier to that point. So we've applied it. And then we're just going to dice it to force an edge flow just in this area. And now we have the shape able to actually deform properly. So while we still have this lattice being live, we're still destructive, non-destructive, kind of hybrid working right now. Sometimes you have to break some eggs to make an omelet. And so, when it comes to something like this, we may have to apply some modifiers because of the construction methods that we chose to do things. As we get through the modifiers, we'll be talking about alternative construction methods we could be using for assembly. But just like that, we're able to just build this shape very quickly and just use lattices to get it where we want. And then we can still press Q and just click on one of these options to actually adjust the spans. And I love adding extra spans to a lattice after I've blocked it in to just basically round it out and make it a little more equalized. So let's go ahead and delete this shape. And we'll just add a cube and focus back in. And under add modifier, the next thing we'll talk about is screw. So we're sending this cube off and we're going to shift A add a plane. So the best way to show screw and our take on it is that you can press Alt X to bring up the mirror, and we're going to use bisect to just cut half of this off. And we're going to just grab this point and control click mark to bevel it. If you've watched many of my solenoid videos, I do this technique a lot. And so with this plane, we can now go under here and just spin it. So we actually chose the right axis for bisecting it, but normally it could cause some issues. If we change the axis with X, we might be able to see such things. So let's try that. Here we are looking at it showing some red. So anytime you see it blue, it means that your spin went through successfully and the shape that you resulted in is going to be able to be beveled without issue. We'll control click bevel to actually add an additional bevel on top. And then we'll control click bevel to add an additional bevel on top of that. And if we press Alt V and turn off our wireframe, this is basically the shape that we've spun up. And the interesting thing about this is that it's all non-destructive, so we can control scroll back up to our first bevel and adjust this main profile that we have here. And if I were talking about bevel more in depth, I would talk about how you can scroll through profiles and save profiles, but I'll spare you at this time. But we can still go through and just make dynamic adjustments to this. So this is where spin kind of jumps into us with our workflow. And there's more to spin than even that. Like that's just me using spin to basically create a revolving object. But if we were to take a plane and merge everything to a single point, and we look at it from top view and we begin making some modifications of just extruding, we're just kind of creating like this sci-fi wall, right? We can go back in and go under screw and just press 3 in order to change it to extrude mode, where instead of spinning it around, it actually just extrudes it straight using a spin of 0. And we're able to just quickly create a wall. I like to follow up on these by just going back with bevel and just adding a bevel, and then following back up on that and just adding a solidify, And then at this point, I could just control click bevel to just follow up on that with a final level bevel, press 1 to adjust the shading for it. And then finally, I can just alt click sharpen to add a weighted normal. So if we look at our stack here, screw is the very foundation of things, but we're just barely getting started here. And we can just bring a cube in and, you know, start having some fun with this. Just take this, perform a difference. Maybe we don't want a difference. Maybe we want to shift the bowl and turn this into like sci-fi glass. So I could press Alt M and we could shift click blank material to turn this into glass. We could just give this a random material. We can go to the bottom, add another cube, scale it out, get it to fit our shape just right. I could be using 2Shape for this, but I sometimes just like having fun with just inserting cubes myself. So with this shape, instead of just letting it be at the bottom like this and duplicating it to the top, we're just going to use array, and I'm going to press X until we change it to Z, and we're just going to push that up like so. I was actually going to push it all the way up, but I don't know, something about grabbing it right there just strikes me. So we'll press 1 and just isolate these collections, and we're looking at this object where we've created this like kind of quarantine sidewall, just very quick, slapped it with blank materials, and we're already good to go. And that in a nutshell is basically what we bring to the table when it comes to spin. And we also are still able to grab these objects and array them. I didn't even talk about multi-object arraying, which is a thing that we're still able to do depending on which type of arraying that you use. By default, we use the type of arraying that allows you to duplicate multiple objects, keeping each of their offsets. But if you're using relative instead, that's going to be an issue. So relative versus constant offset is a talk for another day. But with that, I believe we have talked about spin. When it comes to Weld is a different situation. Fairly new to Blender. It has become a acquaintance in my workflow fairly quickly. So to show it in a nutshell, we'll just grab this and we'll press Ctrl B, bevel it just like before, putting an edge in the middle that's problematic. And this time we're not even going to clean it up. We're just going to leave this extra edge here that we know that's there because we made it together. And we're going to bring in a cylinder, rotate it to the front, and set it up. And this is one of my favorite examples. So we see that once we set up that difference, it just disappeared. And the reason it disappeared is because of this single edge. We remove it, it's fine. But we're going to leave that edge because we want to power through this. So let's actually go to Modifier and Weld. And we see that currently it's showing our wireframe, but the Weld is actually healing it after the difference. What we want to do is make it heal it before the difference. And now we're actually able to get a better result. But we can also roll the Weld to get an even better result depending on what type of cleanup we want to see happen here. But we can't do it with Weld being at the bottom. So this is where going under Add Modifier, and if we hover over Add Weld, we see that we can add a second weld. So let's add a second weld. And this weld is actually used for dealing with some of these near misses. So you can see as I'm rolling the wheel that these verts are kind of jumping over, just helping heal this area up a little bit better so that when I come through and add a sharpen, we actually get a more optimal result. Except this shading artifact in the middle just isn't going to be able to live, and it's more than likely because we have two edges sitting on top of each other. But now we're able to at least get this looking a lot better. If we turn this weld off, we can see what we were dealing with originally, where the shading was just a little bit more problematic with the weld being able to at least help us on our way to getting a better topological cleanup happening. With this shape, we probably also want to at least shade smooth, so that way the boolean that we performed is also shaded smooth. So we'll take this cube and I'll tap into edit mode, right click, subdivide, subdivide, subdivide in order to add a bunch of loops, and then we'll press C and just grab this geometry and just extrude it out. And we see that there's already quite a few bits of faces existing that may not be completely necessary. So what if we were to try to bevel this? Well, we can only bevel it so far, but if we were to press Alt V and look at the wireframe, we see that this is quite a dense wireframe. And if we wanted to, say, simplify this, this is where Decimate would come in. Decimate will do by default what's called a planar dissolve. So if we look at this, we can actually move this up one level and actually solve it even better, just allowing us to get only the most essential geometry. So look at it almost like a modifier version of clean mesh. Another way to also handle it is if we have a plane here and we subdivide and then Shift R, repeat this a couple of times, we have this shape. However, we can also go under Decimate, and if we hover over it, we see that there's a shift click where it will basically use an unsubdivision. An unsubdivision is another way of approaching Decimate, where basically it will remove a subdivision level, allowing us to quickly realign geometry to have a different angle to it. And you know, I'll follow something like that up with a wireframe to turn it into a grate, and just like that you can quickly create a grate. And if we want to take it a step further, we could add a bevel to it and just scroll the bevel up the stack, maybe to maybe above Decimate, press 2 to bevel vertices, and then we just roll it back and we're able to create a very different type of grate just playing with our modifier stack here. In fact, if we wanted to really use hops to the max, we could go to hops tool, where we can actually grab certain modifiers by the dots and actually adjust them interactively in a viewport while we just go in and decide how we actually want things to look with this. In fact, now I'm just messing with the profile to create an alternative type of grate, and then we'll just press P to turn that back off, and we see that the bevel's just a little bit out of control. So we may want to actually go in and turn on clamp overlap for bevel just to prevent such things from happening. But that would also limit the final result that we're able to get at the end here. But I just wanted to show that there is some versatility that's able to be found using Decimate with both its subdivide and its planar simplification that behaves more like clean mesh. Our take on Triangulate's a little different as well. So the best way to show this is to take this into edit mode, and we'll just bevel this edge manually. And then we'll Shift A, add a box here, and then we'll select both of these and perform a difference. And so now we have this Boolean setup happening. So let's say that we wanted to convert this into a subdivision workflow. Well, first I would press Alt V in order to look at the wireframe. And then if we press Control 1 to add a sub D at level 1, we see that this mesh just gets absolutely destroyed. And even sharpening it and impressing it will not be able to save us in the situation. So this is where, you know, first we want to basically protect the hard parameters, the sharp edges, and we could do that by applying things. But let's say that we want to keep everything non-destructive and live. Well, that would be us going into bevel and actually pressing 3 to use what's called a subdivision conversion bevel. And this will provide some adequate spacing surrounding the areas that are important for us to deal with. And then the next thing from here is for us to go under Triangulate. When we add Triangulate, all we triangulate are the areas that have n-gon. So anything that has a quad is just ignored and left to its own devices, while anything that's an n-gon will be corrected. And now this mesh is basically acceptable for export. But even more importantly is we could press Control 1, 2, or 3, and we see that this mesh is also acceptable for booleans. And the best part is we can press Q and go under our bool scroll and bring back up this and adjust this cutter on the fly, and we still have subdivision capability. So Triangulate has a very special place in our workflow that's used for certain types of control situations whenever we're not trying to deal with these things manually. But a little bit of creative use of the subdivision with Triangulate can definitely go a long ways, along with a bevel to space things out. We'll perform another difference here, and we see that it didn't work out. So if you've been following this videos up to this point, you might remember that I talked about the need to sort sub D above boolean. So we'll select this and perform a difference, and now we see that we got the intended result. So sometimes you want subdivision to be sorted for situations like this, but there's also situations where you may not want such a thing to occur. So, you know, we'll place our cursor here, bring in another cube, and we'll perform one more boolean just to really grind this point home, and we'll bring back this cutter and just make adjustments to it dynamically. And we see that it's playing along just fine with subdivision, even though in these areas it's just really solving as it would when subdivision would. But if we press Alt V and we get out of wireframe, we see that this shape is looking fairly good, aside from the fact that this initial shape didn't have smoothing. So we'll just turn on smoothing, and it looks like the rest of the shapes actually receive smoothing, so they're actually good to go. But we can actually press Alt V, go back into wireframe, and if we select the shape and we press Q and we go to bevel, you can see that I'm able to still adjust the amount of tightness that's happening with these edges and the amount that I'm just letting sub D handle with the way that sub D does handle arcing things that tend to have spacing between them. But even better is I can roll the wheel to add another level of spacing loops in between this, which will protect the perimeters protection to ensure that even that area maintains the integrity that's intended with the form that we've given it. But hopefully that sheds some light on basically our needs for Triangulate inside of hard ops. So the next thing we want to discuss in our modifier list is wireframe. Wireframe is real simple. Basically, clicking it will convert the object to a wireframe, which can be very useful. Just like I showed previously, you can use something like a plane, and we will just put a subdivision on it, but we'll shift click it to put a simple one on it. And then we can actually use a unsubdivide with a decimate, which will give us this really interesting result. But we do want to up the levels, and then from here we can go under wireframe and just turn this into a grate. So same example as before, but this in a nutshell is what we use wireframe for. Another way we also like to use wireframe is we'll take something like a cube, and first we'll bevel it, but we want to bevel it with only one loop, and we'll press P to give it a profile. And in face mode, I'll just select the opposite, press I, and we can just search for poke. And I can already tell you I've messed this up, so we will just convert it to a wireframe. And then from here, we can add modifier. We'll go with array, press X to change it to Z, press 1 to slap it to the very top, meaning 1. And now we've created like this sort of railing, right? And so even funner than that is you can press Q, add a modifier like a lattice, go to a Z, and just add spans to it and just start shaping this into some sort of radio tower. So this has always been a type of tool exercise that we do a lot internally as well, just to make sure that certain tools are working in conjunction with each other. But this in a nutshell is the reason that we support and use hard ops wireframe. So continuing on, we're just deleting cubes and taking them on adventures and bringing in new cubes. The next modifier we want to talk about is the weighted normal. The weighted normal is so prolific in Blender 2.89 and probably going forward that we integrated it into Sharpen itself, where I'm literally alt-clicking Sharpen to add a weighted normal. Special care has been taken with weighted normal to make sure that if weighted normal is placed differently in a stack than it's supposed to be, that it will just get placed properly. You can get weighted normal sorted automatically for any object selected, every object selected. Basically, if you have them selected and you choose this, and it will automatically jump to the keep sharp option, which is now our default. So there's really not a whole lot to it, because I've used it all throughout this whole video. So hopefully the point of how it improves with planar shading has been really driven home. So the next thing we'll talk about is smooth. So the best way to show smooth is to just kind of get random and create like a little part here. We'll just conceptually make a radio. Nothing serious. Not the best radio, but whenever I bevel, the profile always remains where I left it at, which is probably one of my least favorite things about the array and bevel, or the bevel inside of Blender itself, is that it will it'll set your profile and it'll leave your profile there. It's always just driven me crazy, not trying to rant about it, but just something to mention while I'm dealing with that situation. So we'll sharpen this, and we'll take these two things and just union them together, which worked out as I was thinking in my head it would. And so this is our object so far. So we're just going to go under settings and just voxelize this object. And it voxelized all right, but I think we can voxelize it a little better. We're going to take the voxel number and actually divide it by half and voxelize it by even less. So now we have this as our object. So by going under smooth, you're able to just kind of roll the wheel and then move the mouse to adjust the factor to just smooth these objects. And I found this to be really essential for things like voxelization, where I'll build in a shape and just really round it out, get these nice integrations happening, and then come back and use booleans to make things even better. So we can just add a cube here and just cut this out and perform a difference. And we'll go back and scroll back for the one of the booleans that made this thing, which I can't seem to find now. That's fine. We'll just bring in a cylinder. That's fine. and we don't want to be looking at it in perspective for this. And for this thing, we may want to ensure that we have crease on and all that when it comes to sharpening, so that we can go under operations and sharpen this thing, because as you see, this is one of those times where it's not in the main menu because it's rarely used this way. But now we're able to up-res this with subdivision while keeping the form of the cylinder. So sometimes I'll put in a cylinder that's 32 around, and then I'll use S-sharpen in order to just give it a extra level of creasing, and then I'll just put a subdivision on in order to get a finer shape. But as you see, I was able to basically start this shape off with voxelization, and now I'm just using booleans to just continue on my path with this. Of course, because of the density of the geometry, beveling isn't going to be an option here. I mean, it might to an extent, but at this point you may also want to experiment with, say, maybe using Decimate, which Decimate is only going to work to such an extent depending on the curvature that's available. But at least now we've set this shape up a little bit better to receive a bevel. However, having a shape that has a form that dissolves so badly into a flat isn't really my cup of tea. So we do prefer to have continuity control all the way around when it comes to a shape. But in a nutshell, that's what you can expect when it comes to smooth. So I use smooth for a whole lot of things. Like we could subdivide this cube, and then if we go under add modifier and smooth, we can just roll the wheel to just kind of smooth this thing down in a different way than you would if you were, say, putting subdivision on it. And Laplacian and smooth is kind of the same thing. You know, I would recommend looking into the modifiers themselves to understand their intricacies, but just explaining how we approach them. Another thing about smooth that's worth noting is that if you hover over it, there's this control behavior where it'll add a new one, which, you know, most of them have that same option, but the shift one is the one we're talking about. Shift click will basically auto add a new vertex group. So the best way to show this is to create a shape that probably is worth saving. So we'll just do something fast because I'm hoping over the course of this video you guys are just understanding what I'm talking about, so I don't have to be so cursory and basic in my explanations anymore. We'll just set this to bisect mod. And so we have this thing that's being modified. You know, we're just creasing edges. I'm just really thinking on the fly as far as what I want this to become. But it looks like, you know, you start playing with some creases, it'll start making some sense. But creasing is one of those things that, as long as you're mindful of your modifier stack and where things are being placed, you should be able to have a fairly good time with it. But if not, you are in for a educational experience. So with this particular shape, let's say I wanted to run a smooth on it. I would run a smooth and it would do something like this. That isn't actually the most desirable result. What if I actually only wanted to smooth the areas that are not marked with red lines? Because that would actually result in a much different experience with the smooth modifier. And even better than that, what if we didn't smooth this area in between? Because that's going to cause the middle to collapse in on itself. And these questions is actually where the shift behavior of smooth and for Laplacian smooth came about. If we shift click it, we see that it creates a V group, and then whenever you scroll, you actually get a much different type of result, but that results in even more control. And it also creates a vertex group that you can go in and modify. But being able to protect the middle point is definitely essential for things like this. I mean, this isn't the best case for demonstrating it, but it is a case for showing times where you may want to protect your perimeter while smoothing other areas on the inside. Like, let's say I was doing topological reconstruction in here, and I wanted to keep certain areas that were marked in red, like new cylinders being inserted, to be held while I'm trying to heal and smooth the areas around it geometrically without having to use normal hacking. Then I would just use it this way. And I've used this a couple of times over the course of several jobs, and so I found that it was definitely one of those things that needed to be made into its own tool. Alright, so Laplacian smooth is a little bit much of the same, but the next one that we'll actually talk about is simple deform. So simple deform is one that you'll see me rarely use, but you can go in and just use the same things you use with the mod. You roll the wheel, it'll change what it does from taper to bend to twist. And there's even some notification text to let you know what's happening with it. So this is one of those things that, you know, if I had a shape that was a little bit longer and had some loops in it, and was probably displaced out. Got to move my mouse a bit there. Gonna have to see about some accelerators after this. We look into that, and we hit it with simple deform. And let's see, the one we're looking for is, there we go. We're looking for bend, but we actually want to move the mouse the other way. And so now we're able to actually bend this object around. And so this is kind of our approach to simple deform. I mean, we use it a lot more inside of Hop's tool. And then with our other specialty tools, we actually take better care of maintaining your origins where we don't have you, the user, having to deal with this stuff. But simple deform is there for you in times where if you do have to adjust your simple deform modifier when present in stack, it's at least available to you. So we'll go ahead and remove that. And the next one we'll talk about is shrink wrap. Subdivision we already talked about. Subdivision is pretty much the same as when you press Control 1 through 4, except you also have the ability to put a simple subdivision, which will basically not distort the surface. So it'll basically just convert every face into 4, but won't do any sort of arc correction for how sub D normally changes things. So with shrink wrap's goal is to shrink object A to object B. So let's say that we had a cylinder, and with our cylinder we wanted to shrink wrap this area, which I'm just going to go ahead and make it a group. But let's select both of these and just choose shrink wrap because it works best with 2 objects. In fact, with one it does nothing. And we see that shrink wrap has been set up. However, we do want to change some of these settings. So we want to probably project it on the Z from what we're looking at here. Also, we want to change our vertex group to be just the bottom group. And we could also take advantage of this because now that this is actually conforming to the surface, we can grab this face and say Control click mark to add a bevel. But instead of just beveling it to the point that it's rounded like you see here, we can press N and actually flip the normal to get something like this. And so now we actually have this conformal fitting thing that's on here that's actually growing out of the surface and has some sort of connection. And then we can do the same thing with the top. We just Control click that, but we see that it has an issue, and this is because of the mod order. So shift scrolling to move it up, we can now actually get this place where we need it. And the best part of this is this object is actually way up here somewhere. So if we were to say duplicate, put an edge loop in here and we split this, we see that we get a little bit more versatility with it, but we do need to ensure that it's able to wrap to these areas. And also, I can't speak for Bevel's ability to be able to bevel with such a skew on such a very simplified face. But that is the basic idea behind shrink wrap. Not so much doing things like this, but just the ability to say have object B and select object A and just have these 2 objects shrink wrap to each other, which comes in handy for all sorts of aspects of the workflow when it comes to hard ops. In fact, for this, we can just grab this and subdivide, just add a little more geo to it. In fact, if we really want to have fun with it, we could just put a level of sub D on it and slap it 1 level up higher in the stack, maybe put simple on it. And then we could actually look through levels in the viewport and see how it's interacting with it. And then of course, keep in mind that shrink wrap has its own level of interactivity that it's capable of having when it comes to the subsurf modifier to help it conform to the mesh. But shrink wrap's always one of those iffy things as far as how well it's going to work and benefit you in your personal workflow, which is why sometimes I opt for just linear snapping to just get the job done. But I just wanted to show that we do have a workflow for shrink wrap inside of hard ops that's still a work in process, but it's still a thing nonetheless. Cast is another modifier that barely gets a lot of shine, but is just one of our options. As I look at it, sometimes I wonder if maybe just removing functionality would make Hop simpler for new users. So we may be experimenting with that in the future, but I'm hoping that through this video series or long video that people just get it. But we'll just go ahead and click this, and we see that we're able to cast this into a sphere. And by overshooting, we can actually turn this into a raspberry very quickly. We can also roll this and turn this into different types of shapes. Like here, we're turning this into a cylinder, basically the hard way. Turn it into a sphere, cube, cylinder, and then we can always just exaggerate to get really interesting shapes here, which while this looks like a bit of a disaster, If I were to Control A and turn my geometry to a mesh, we can actually delete these top faces that are just way too much for what we're talking about here. But I actually see some topological samples in here that may be worth keeping, or even just this whole shape in general. In fact, let's say I wanted to keep this whole top face. How would I do it? Well, I would sharpen it and then press L to select just this face, giving us this. So I mean, there's always creative uses able to be found in these modifiers and what you're able to do with them. So it is just one of those things that I recommend users just give a shot to. But when it comes to cast is better explained through our use in sphere cast. So to just sneak ahead and actually show that, like I showed you, you can use cast to turn something into a sphere, but that's only if you have enough geo for it. And most of the time, you're not even going to want to do that. But let's say you had a cube and you just want to turn it into a sphere. That's where sphere cast comes in. All it does is puts a subdivision, puts a cast, turns it to a sphere. And I use this all the time in jobs that require that I make spherical objects of acceptable topology or human eyes or whatever the case may be, or even heads. You know, sometimes I'll just sphere cast something just to get a perfect sphere, and then I'll just go from there. And so that's probably just one of the best uses of cast that we have inside of HardOps. So the last modifiers that we will be going over is skin. Now skin is its own mess of a modifier, and what I mean by that is that, you know, skin's great and all, but it is just kind of rough when it comes to its hard surface applications. I mean, you're of course able to do things like this where I was able to turn this cube into kind of a mesh of itself, but there's always going to be a degree of kind of weirdness when it comes to managing it to get the exact results that you want, or at least I've found in the past. And then with the whole thing of having to mark things as root and, you know, being able to equalize the radius, I just recommend that if you do use skin, that you just spend a little bit of time getting used to how Blender intended for it to be used, and then think about how it could also be used in hard surface applications. So with the subdivision modifier, I'm just going to shift deduplicate it, and if we move it up, we see that we actually are able to get a much smoother form here because the subdivision is actually arcing these before it actually gets to the skin, but it turns the rest of this into a very strange torment sack. But it is still an interesting result nonetheless. And then of course we can just combo this with the smooth, where we just roll this enough, move the wheel, and we're already getting somewhere. You know, maybe we want to make it just a little bit thicker, and just like that, we've created some interesting object. I mean, whenever I first started Blender, I used to play with the modifiers and tools to make things, and I would make things that I would never be able to make ever again. So part of our tools aim to connect users with that aspect of themselves, with creating those things that just were fun over the course of learning to understand the tools. So let's delete this cube, and we'll add a final cube, and let's talk about UV project. And with UV project, it's almost not worth talking about in the context of a cube, but when you click it, just by default, it's going to place these empties, which these empties assist it with a type of mapping called triplanar mapping. If we jump over to texture mode, you see that it's not very assistive right now when it comes to actually judging what's going on here. So let's undo, and let's actually look at the tooltip for this. So the tooltip shows that if you shift click it, it will add a grid material. So if we shift click it, it now adds a grid material to the mesh, which also means that if we were to mess with these empties, we could see what's going on here. So the UV project system, as far as how it's used in HOPS, is used for helping people make basically procedural UV maps that are able to utilize a type of triplanar mapping that's able to be used using projector empties. This was something that was suggested to us by a user for assistance with UE. However, I do plan to do a tutorial going about that more in depth as I dive more into Unreal myself and how it can help users using HardOps. But just notice that now, as of the latest versions of HardOps, that we now support UV project sorting, so I'm able to cut continuously, and the UVs are able to be maintained no matter what happens on this shape. So it is something that's worth checking out. However, it is no replacement for actual UVs. But if you're the type of person to deal with just triplanar mapping in Blender, whether you're texturing chips or gigantic objects or massive mecha that you just don't want to deal with textures, then this is definitely the tool for you. We found it to be pretty interesting in some of our initial tests, and also, you know, it's just something appealing about seeing your grid look like this. In fact, we can take this and add a bevel to it, and we see that even the bevel is receiving UVs. However, this shape is too close to this shape right here, so we want to just move that up, and then we can actually give this a bigger bevel, and we can actually see how the bevel is receiving the UV map as well. However, it's not actually looking continuous, and this is because of the sorting for it. So if we place the bevel before the UV map, we can now see that it actually looks the way that you would expect it to look. But UV map is just one of those newer tools that we added to HardOps to hopefully help expand on light map exporting game workflows and things like that, and also procedural UVing for conceptual work inside of Blender. So if it's one of those things that you don't understand at this time, I would definitely recommend checking out the documentation as far as the Blender documentation for the UV projector and what it can offer you. But I just wanted it to be known that this is something that's also supported inside of HardOps and has been supported as deeply as Sort.